Thank you, Karen. I do have one quick correction to make. This morning, Karen suggested that we have 20 speakers from 11 different countries. She forgot that I'm from a different country. I come from the country called the South. I hope you can understand my English. In 1822, a remarkable event took place involving the British monarchy and its subjects in Scotland. It brought to conclusion one of the greatest success stories of conservatism in the modern West. For 20 days in August, George IV toured Edinburgh and other points of Scottish interest. It was the first time in nearly 200 years that an official royal visit took place, and the event itself was orchestrated largely by the famed Scotsman Sir Walter Scott, author of Ivanhoe and the Waverley Romances. That George visited Scotland was itself an important feat, but what mattered most was how he dressed, what he wore. When the king arrived in Edinburgh, he exited his carriage proudly wearing a kilt fashioned in the fabric of a Stuart tartan. This fashion, symbolic of Scottish identity, was previously outlawed by George's great-grandfather. The weather was typical of Scotland in that time of year, or any time of year. Cold, gray, and wet. George's kilt was a bit too short, and not wishing to catch cold, the king wore pink tights, easily visible beneath the tartan. Still, the crowd was delighted, and whether Sir Walter realized it was one of the greatest achievements of his life. There, one man who was nothing more than a romance novelist was credited with recovering Scottish culture and conserving for posterity many of its most cherished traditions. For 80 years, the English deliberately sought to weaken Scottish culture, subdue any political opposition to the British crown, and ultimately scattered the remaining Scots throughout the empire. The Jacobite uprising of Charles Stuart ended in 1746 at the Battle of Culloden, after which Parliament passed the Act of Proscription that outlawed the wearing of Scottish tartans, playing of bagpipes, and the teaching of the Gaelic language. Y'all. Soon thereafter, the Highland clearances began that further undermined clan culture, removed people from their ancient homesteads, and sent many to the far reaches of the empire. And even though the British branded the Highland Scots as traitors, such was only a culmination of generations of crude belittlement. In the eyes of the English elite, the Scots were deplorable. They stubbornly clinged to ancient Christian rites and traditions. They spoke a funny language, ate odd food, dressed in backward fashions, lived far away from metropolitan centers, and above all, never showed respect to their English betters. Their symbols, songs, and ways of life would not be tolerated. And yet, 4 generations later, those things that once symbolized their backwardness would be paraded by George IV as the cutting edge of court fashion. Indeed, what happened in Scotland reflected centuries of similar abuse of other cultural groups deemed deplorable by ruling elites in the modern West. The pattern is consistent. Small groups of people gain substantial political power, declare their opponents to be backward, then make their region, class, values, religious beliefs, and political demeanor to be the country's established norm. Everyone else, especially those who most oppose them, are branded backward, lazy, spiteful, uneducated, and fit only to labor in the most menial of tasks. It is no coincidence that the same depictions of Highland Scots in the 18th century are the very same used against their Hoosier, bumpkin, hayseed, and redneck descendants in North America. And yet it is most often the case, ladies and gentlemen, that those the elites disdained the most in our history are the ones who kept freedom and liberty alive. I'm a college professor. You don't have to clap. It's okay. These two terms, liberty and freedom, were not always synonymous and occasionally even set at odds. As the historian David Hackett Fisher reminds us, each term grew from two distinct traditions in Europe, one southern and one northern. Dispersed across its history, Western civilization includes notable examples of how both liberty and freedom, as we know it, endured near extinction at the hands of ruling elites bent on the preservation of their own power. Often it was not the elites that proved to be the friends of these terms. Instead, those best capable of preserving liberty and freedom were outcasts, the impoverished, or those previous elites who were excluded from political power. Whether in Irish monasteries, European free cities, medieval Jewish ghettos, among African American slaves, or in the declining estates of Saxon nobility and the French nobles of the sword, those often deemed the most backward just so happened to be the ones most likely to connect with those two ancient words and their meanings. Liberty originated in the Mediterranean world, where it evolved from Roman legal traditions of rights, responsibilities, and natural law. It emphasized that all people have intrinsic worth, no matter their social class and legal standing, and as such, formed the basis for individual liberty today. Freedom, on the other hand, had Germanic and Northern European origins, and etymologically descended from the same terms in which English-speaking people derived the words freehold and neighbor. Freedom meant you were part of something greater than yourself, an association of people, families, friends, and those who share the same cultural identity. And yet, both the ideas that undergirded liberty and freedom, as well as their practices, may well have been lost had they not been preserved during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire by Benedictine monasteries. There, monks dedicated themselves to preserving the literature, poetry, and philosophical documents of the ancient world in the wake of barbarian invasions, warfare, plagues, and pestilence. Over the centuries, the example of the Benedictines was repeated countless times by many other unsuspecting groups and individuals. None ever thought that they were creating freedom or liberty. They simply thought they were preserving what made their lives worth living. We are not supposed to remember their stories, and the stories of these associations and individuals. Instead, we are supposed to believe that our liberties today exist because intellectuals created them, rather than growing over the centuries from deep cultural crevices, gradually, accidentally, and often one step forward and two steps back. We are to remember those elites and intellectuals who turned their eyes away from the customs and social circumstances used to preserve liberty and freedom, and rested instead in their own ability to transform these things into abstract and universal ideas. You see, across the European Enlightenments of the 17th and 18th centuries, the European intelligentsia usually agreed that for any political order or culture to be sustained, it must be imposed from the top upon the middling and lower social orders. To be truly free, European peoples needed social and political revolutions. The results of these grand and expensive experiments in refabricating society all ended the same way: in abject failure, widespread murder, and economic collapse. Failed plans for social engineering, ladies and gentlemen, were not confined to the British Isles in the 1600s or in the continent in the 1700s and 1800s. It occurred here at the very start of English colonization in North America and continues to shape our country today. The initial founders of the colonies committed themselves to creating bold, new social experiments. Whether it was the New Jerusalem of the New England colonies, the New Eden of Virginia, or in the villages of brotherly love in the Delaware Valley, the singular theme of early American colonization involved abstract visions of order being imposed upon usually willing colonists. And yet each of these colonies faced exactly the same crisis early on in their settlement. They failed. Every single one of them. The Puritan Commonwealth of New England, dedicated to ensuring every thought, act, and deed was dedicated to glorifying God, failed within 2 generations. The gentry from the south of England, who hoped to recreate that society in Virginia, failed within 70 years of the first settlers in Jamestown. Quakers, wishing to make Pennsylvania an example to the world of how brotherly love can organize a society, produced one of the most corrupt colonies in North America. In the Carolinas, efforts to transplant an odd recreation of French feudalism never made it across the Atlantic, despite John Locke's efforts to do so. Even General Oglethorpe's vision of creating a colony in Georgia to redeem prisoners never attracted enough colonists to survive until the experiment was abandoned. Ladies and gentlemen, these were dark times that tried the hearts of early Americans. Every single colony that would become the United States suffered failure and nearly collapsed had the colonists not embraced one important solution. When politics failed, the colonists depended on the things they successfully brought with them. They depended upon their cultures. It involved their dialects, their food, how they named their children, their sport, how they married, even how they buried their dead. These were the real ingredients of their freedom and the means by which they exercised their liberty in a stable political order. The habits and customs of daily life, which were produced by centuries of associations and neighborly interactions, proved to be the source of their survival. And in the end, these colonists became some of the most culturally conservative groups in Western civilization. And while not everyone enjoyed the same benefit, British North Americans committed to living lives of freedom and liberty and fought successfully to keep them and ultimately fought for others to gain them. The colonists learned valuable lessons which can still guide us today, ladies and gentlemen, and not surprisingly, mirrored those used by Sir Walter Scott generations later. So to return to Walter Scott and George IV's visit to Scotland in 1822, there are perhaps a couple of lessons to be drawn. How to save civilization in dark times. It's often said that Sir Walter almost singularly saved Scotland, though many argued he reinvented it that year. What Scott understood is that ideas alone or ideas shorn from their cultural roots will not win the battles of the modern world. Victory requires more than abstract reasoning about principles or competing in academic debates. People need to think, but they also need to live. In fact, by the time Scott started writing his famous novels and poetry, Scottish education was already superior to that of the rest of England. They had no lack of the right ideas. When their very lives are subject to humiliation or treated as social cancers to be extricated, what the Scots needed most was to learn once again how to openly love their culture. They needed forms of education that could successfully reinforce appreciation for the customs that had produced their freedoms. They needed imagination and gratitude. Today, we live in a dark age, and no place seems darker than California. So I conclude speaking to you, not as Americans, but as Californians. Ideas matter, but ideas alone will never win culture wars. They will not win battles of the heart. Is there an old California waiting for its Walter Scott? Or is California now only a place for desperate housewives? And politicians perhaps equally desperate for national power? Is there anything here worth remembering and preserving? Californians, I speak to you as a Virginian, where the land is green. Every day, others remind you that you live in a desert. As your ancestors brought water to this desert, the time has come to once again water it with the spring of imagination, regularly tending it by living the life you love, and never allow a self-appointed and decadent elite to make you feel unworthy of their respect. I urge you, tell your stories once again. Tell of the things common to your life. Tell of your great coastline and your forest. Tell of your inventors and your explorers. Tell of your food and of your music. If there is ever to be a fat and foreign king wearing the colors of California, you must tell your own honest stories and do so without shame. Thank you.